There's a famous quote from esteemed Nintendo game designer and producer Shigeru Miyamoto that goes, "A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad." And throughout The Art of Failure, we've looked at games that perhaps needed more time in development. We've seen the effects of rushing development to reach a holiday release date and rushing to beat an expiring license. Yet, we've also seen the effects of allowing for delays, and that ultimately working out for the better. But sometimes, all the delays in the world can't save a game. Sometimes a game gets delayed to the point that's assumed it will never come out. Sometimes a game gets delayed to a point where it seems impossibly big in scope. And sometimes a game winds up in development purgatory, an odd state of limbo where it has almost no chance of escaping. The story we're telling today does not solely deal with delays. Rather, this is a story of ambitions and dreams. It is also a story of stress, sickness, confusion, and exhaustion. This is the story of a game that many thought could change an industry, but never even had the chance to try. This is the story of Sonic X-Treme for the Sega Saturn and its death during development. The story of this unreleased Sonic game begins with the release of another. We find ourselves in late 1994 at the Sega Technical Institute, located at 255 Shoreline Drive in Redwood City. This particular day marked a momentous occasion for STI. A newly developed game, Sonic & Knuckles, was released for the Sega Genesis. Sonic & Knuckles was the culmination of years of work put in by an incredibly talented group of programmers and designers known as Sonic Team. It was the fifth mainline title in the Sonic the Hedgehog series. It was the fourth of those on the Sega Genesis hardware. It would be a huge success and further cemented Sonic himself as one of the defining pop culture icons of the 1990s. But 5 years prior, parent company Sega didn't have a Sonic. Sega didn't have a Sonic Team. Sega barely had any market presence outside of arcades. They were not a household name in Japan, and especially weren't in North America. Their predecessor to the Genesis, the Sega Master System, had only managed to sell well in parts of Europe and Brazil, which, though impressive, was not the success that those in charge of Sega Enterprises were looking for. In the United States in 1989, there was only one video game company that seemed to matter to the masses: Nintendo. Nintendo, through both aggressive marketing and dubiously legal exclusive licensing agreements, had managed to make their NES console a staple of 1980s households. Though competition to their platform had come from companies such as Sega, Atari, and even smaller companies such as Worlds of Wonder, none of them were able to dethrone Nintendo as industry kings. What bolstered the NES's dominance was that many NES consoles shipped with a killer app as a pack-in title. This was the original Super Mario Bros., a side-scrolling platforming game that was so successful that propelled the titular Super Mario to superstardom. Mario even went on to colloquially get the nickname of Mr. Video Game. Come 1989 though, and Sega had a plan to take on Nintendo's aging 8-bit console.
Genesis from Sega. Genesis, the new generation in video games.
That year in North America, they released the 16-bit Sega Genesis, which was leaps and bounds ahead of the NES in terms of power and featured high-quality ports of many of Sega's arcade games. Within months of release, it seemed like a flop. After doing some internal reshuffling, including bringing on a new executive for Sega of America in the form of Thomas Kalinske, it seemed that the Genesis could turn around. But those at both Sega of Japan and Sega of America knew that the Genesis needed a killer app of its own, one that both played better than Super Mario Bros., but also featured a character who was everything that Mario wasn't. That was to say, they needed a character with a bit of edge and attitude to counter Mario's seemingly staunch family friendliness. By 1990, Sega was tired of being a distant second to Nintendo in terms of sales. Though they already had a platforming mascot in the form of Alex Kidd, many felt that he was too similar to Mario to truly set Sega apart. As such, an internal competition was held at Sega of Japan, where those working there could submit their own designs for a new company mascot. These would eventually include a rabbit, a warrior clown, a chicken wearing shades and skinny jeans, and even a cross between Teddy Roosevelt and Santa Claus. The winning design would come from designer Naoto Oshima. It would be a small blue hedgehog with massive spikes. He would wear red buckled shoes based off of those worn by Michael Jackson on the cover of his Bad album, and he'd have a sensible but impatient personality. Oshima claimed that attribute was based off of then US presidential candidate Bill Clinton. Initially, this character would be known as Mr. Needlemouse. However, he'd soon be christened Sonic the Hedgehog.
Danita Stokes, president of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games, but this new Sonic the Hedgehog, oh, he really doth my doilies. They say he's incredibly fast. Well, what's the hurry, mister? And about his attitude. Smarty pants. Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh! Little brat!
In late 1991, Sonic would see his first major appearance in Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis. It would be developed by a group that had formed within Sega of Japan, featuring Oshima, that would brand themselves Sonic Team. The original Sonic game would soon be packed in with the Genesis console, much like how Super Mario Bros. Had been with the NES. It would go on to be a smash hit, especially in North America.
Some parents are refusing to be taken in.
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to explain to him how people market things to make you spend more money.
Nintendo controls 80% of the video market, though some game players prefer the pictures of its competitor Sega. But no matter how you play the game, or which game you play, things definitely have come a long way since Pac-Man.
With the success of Sonic the Hedgehog came a desire from those both at Sega of Japan and Sega of America for a sequel. However, there were some issues with this. Despite the design of Sonic himself being claimed by Oshima, the actual game engine for Sonic 1 had been created by programmer Yuji Naka. That's to say, Naka was responsible for the core of what made the game tick. Despite Sonic 1's success, Naka was not getting along well with management at Sega of Japan. Thus, after months of unhappiness and embroilment in company politics, he left Sega, hoping to find work elsewhere in the gaming industry. Meanwhile, in California, Sega of America had hired a man by the name of Mark Cerny, famous for creating the arcade game Marble Madness. His task was to set up a new development studio for Sega of America, one that would bring together game designing and development talent from both within the US and abroad. Their mission would be to develop new, character-based games for Sega platforms that could be potentially grown into entire series. This would be the Sega Technical Institute. For the creation of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Cerny brought over several members of the original Sonic team from Sega of Japan. This ultimately included Yuji Naka. Despite declaring that he was done with Sega after leaving their Japanese branch, Naka had been contacted by Cerny shortly afterwards and made a new offer. The deal would be that Naka would come to America and work at STI, and in return, he would have both more creative control and a higher salary. As such, work soon began on Sonic 2, which thanks in part to a powerful marketing campaign, became one of the most anticipated games of 1992. Meanwhile in Japan, Oshima was working on another new Sonic game, with a different team. This would not be a cartridge-based game like Sonic 1 or 2, but rather would be for the CD-based Sega CD add-on. Fittingly enough, this game was titled Sonic CD. Sonic 2, upon release, would be a massive system seller for the Sega Genesis in North America. Sonic would soon appear everywhere. He'd have comics, cartoon shows, and in 1993 would be the first video game character to ever be featured in a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. Though Nintendo had tried to counter Sonic with the release of a new Mario game for their Super Nintendo system, this being Super Mario World, the success of Sonic, and in turn the Genesis, meant that Nintendo no longer reigned unmatched in North America. This era of intense rivalry between Nintendo and Sega would eventually become known as the Console Wars. However, not all was perfect at Sega. The Sega CD add-on had been released earlier in 1992, and had not been a smash hit. Despite being able to add additional power to Genesis consoles and the ability to play both games and audio CDs, a $300 USD price tag, along with the need to already own a Genesis console to make use of it, meant that sales were somewhat slow. Indeed, even when Sonic CD was released in 1993, the Sega CD didn't pick up much steam. In addition, though the Genesis was a huge success in North America, it was a distant third in sales in Japan, trailing behind both the Super Nintendo and NEC's PC Engine console. Some internally at SOA suspected jealousy from their Japanese counterparts, but times were still good in North America. Sonic 3 would come in February 1994, with Sonic and Knuckles following later that year. It seemed like Sega and STI were on top of the world. But following Sonic and Knuckles' release, much of Sonic Team headed back to Japan.
Where does this thing go? I don't know. What kind of cable is that? It's coaxial, man. Come on! Where are we, man? This is crazy. Yeah, but it's cool. Whoa!
Got cable TV? Get Sega Channel. Hook in your Genesis, choose from up to 50 games a month, and play them 24 hours a day. It's here and it's real. I get the winner.
The landscape of gaming had changed since 1989. Sega was no longer perceived as a cool underdog, and the Genesis had become a massive success in North America. Nintendo was also no longer their only major competition, with new consoles rapidly appearing, including a then upcoming powerful CD-based machine from Sony. This would be the PlayStation. In addition, due to middling sales of the Genesis in Japan, SOJ wanted to leave the Genesis behind and move forward with a new console. In around 1994, Sega Enterprises began to look to the future. In Japan, focus was placed on a new 32-bit machine that could perhaps take on the PlayStation. This was called Project Saturn. In North America, however, plans were made for a new system that could extend the life of the aging Genesis. This was called Project Mars. Around the same time in early 1994, a proposal was put together by a small team at STI for a new Sonic game, one that would be Sonic's first foray into a 3D world. Planned for the Mars hardware and featuring characters from the Sonic Saturday morning cartoon show, it would be envisioned by a team consisting of designers and developers Michael Kosaka, Don Goddard, and Chris Senn. Kosaka served as lead designer, while Goddard served as programmer. Senn, on the other hand, had only recently joined the project after volunteering to do some animation work. They would pitch their game idea to Sega of America on the 17th of May, 1994. Despite having a different playstyle from earlier Sonic games, this project, called Sonic Mars, would show potential. To the surprise of some, it would soon get the green light from Sega of America. Upon learning this news, Yuji Naka apparently just shook his head and said good luck. Work would continue on the Sonic Mars project through the following months, and the team would grow and change. New people would join STI during this time, including associate producer Mike Wallis, who would later become producer on this next generation Sonic title. Thus, here we are in 1994 with the stage set. Wallis perhaps defined this era best when, in a 2004 interview with LostLevels.org, he released a Sonic X-Treme development timeline with a preface that will be paraphrased as follows.
To fully understand the entire situation, you must fully understand the players. There's Sega of Japan, SOJ, the parent company of Sega of America, the rulers of the palace. There's Sega of America, which basically was the main group in the US. This contained marketing, sales, PR, and the Sega of America product development group. there was STI, the Sega Technical Institute. This was a very small group that did Sonic 2, Sonic 3, the spin-off Sonic Spinball, and Sonic & Knuckles. They were originally staffed with Sonic team members from Japan, then later with American folks. They also did some other games such as Comix Zone and The Ooze. STI's focus was to create character properties that could be built into franchises. There was Sonic Team, based in Japan, which was mostly Yuji Naka's group, and as for Naka, many credit him with creating Sonic. Those within STI who I spoke to when I arrived say this wasn't true. Never met him because he had departed the US by the time I started at STI.
Michael Wallis had gotten a start in the gaming industry as a teenager, first working as a game tester for Electronic Arts. From there, he'd worked his way up through the industry, eventually landing a job as an associate producer at STI.
So I joined, I was relatively, still pretty inexperienced in the industry, only a couple years under my belt of full-time work. But I joined as an associate producer, was on Comix Zone. And as a producer, you're a project manager, and you can contribute to the creative process, but you keep everybody on task, right? Keep them on schedule, on budget, and at Sega, it's a lot of working with the other departments and marketing, PR, etc., QA, to ensure that your game has the proper representation as far as art use, etc., that the media outlets are fully informed, and that with the QA, and even at the time for Comix Zone, it was the cartridge, the replication team. That your EPROMs were all programmed properly and everything else. So it's just a lot of chasing down logistical ends.
During this time, the Project Mars hardware had also seen further development and eventual release as the Sega 32X. Instead of being a standalone unit, it served as an add-on that attached to the top of a standard Sega Genesis console. Project Mars had originally been created in response to an order given by Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama in January 1994. His instructions: develop a new 32-bit console that will be powerful enough to move the company forward. Despite originally being envisioned as a standalone console, after several Sega of Japan engineers traveled to America and met with producer Joe Miller, the scope was changed to instead be an add-on. Meanwhile, the Saturn console had already been in development for nearly 2 years, and was rumored to be a true 32-bit successor to the Genesis. It was said to be on par with Sega's technically impressive arcade hardware for the time. It was also rumored to contain both a CD drive and a cartridge slot, being able to potentially play its own impressive titles and be backwards compatible with the Genesis. Both the imagination of the wider gaming public and those within Sega of Japan was caught more by Project Saturn than Project Mars. As such, the Saturn was poised by SOJ to be the true successor to the Genesis. However, Sega of America still wanted to extend the Genesis's lifespan, as it was still selling extremely well. Thus, they took on Project Mars themselves, revealing it to the world as a Sega 32X at the Sega's Gamers Day press event in June 1994.
Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his powers. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo! There is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
Thank you.
Reception was lukewarm though, perhaps even confused, as by this point, Sega of Japan had already announced the Sega Saturn. In addition, the 32X had some odd quirks, including a need for its own power supply, in addition to that of the Genesis. Sega of Japan was also unhappy with SOA and the 32X, with some internally seeing the new add-on as nothing more than a way to dilute the potential Saturn user base. Plus, due to requiring a Genesis to be used, the 32X was nowhere near as powerful as a Saturn. In late 1994, Japanese Saturn units arrived at the STI offices, along with copies of the fighting game Virtua Fighter. This cemented the 32X as an internal joke at STI.
I remember we got Japanese Saturns in the office, and everybody spent so many days playing Virtua Fighter because they loved it. And then I remember Virtua Fighter came out on 32X, and we're like, this is terrible, right? So yeah, it was the butt of many jokes internally, even amongst the developers at Sega.
Perhaps poetically, the Sega 32X would finally see release in North America on the 22nd of November 1994, the same day that the Sega Saturn saw release in Japan. Perhaps most damning for Sega, due to being released so close to the Saturn, some third-party developers would be turned away from working with Sega, fearing that they would be making games for hardware that would quickly become obsolete. Meanwhile, Sonic Mars, now known as Sonic 32X, was continuing along in development. By the end of 1994, though, most of this early progress had just culminated in some technical prototypes and character concept art. But even then, work was continuing at a pace that led some to believe that Sonic 32X could be a major system seller for Sega's new successor to the Genesis. Assuming, of course, that that's what the 32X platform was intended as.
1994年、それははるか土星で開発された。
Saturn from Saturn.
64ビット級ゲームマシン、セガサターン地球新発売。
Sega.
There was confusion felt within Sega. This was soon known somewhat publicly, though the general public was unaware of its scope, along with the scope of the growing rift between SOA and SOJ. People, as a result, began to lose faith in the company. Now more than ever, it was essential for Sega of America to decide what was a true successor to the Genesis, and what platform would define them for the rest of the 90s. Was the 32X their future? Was there any future at all for the 32X platform? After all, despite showcasing strong sales and Sega of America shipping over 300,000 32X units before the end of 1994, sales stagnated after the Christmas shopping seasons, and many titles planned for the platform were cancelled. Indeed, when January 1995 came, many 32X units were returned to retailers, partially due to many launch titles being rushed to market and thus having programming issues. What about the Saturn? Was Sega of Japan really adamant about it being the true successor to the Genesis? Sales were strong in Japan, and the Saturn hardware was clearly more powerful than even the 32X. It would even eventually go on to be Sega's most successful console ever in Japan. However, due to the strong sales of the Genesis in North America, Sega of America was still apprehensive to release it. Some speculated that SOA would opt for a completely different platform to succeed to Genesis. After all, other console projects had been the works at both SOJ and SOA. One of these was Project Jupiter, which would have been a cartridge-based console that would have had similar specifications to the Saturn, which in development had been made into a strictly CD-based console, with its cartridge slot mostly just being used for memory expansions. However, Project Jupiter was scrapped sometime in 1994, along with Project Neptune, which would have been a combination Sega Genesis 32X system that was planned for release sometime in 1995. SOA head Tom Kalinske had found the Saturn to be underwhelming. Though it was on par with Sega's arcade hardware of the time in terms of power, it was hard to develop for in comparison to the competition. In addition, it was not as 3D capable as the likes of the PlayStation. This led to Kalinske at one point to reach out to high-performance computer maker Silicon Graphics in the hopes that they could make a new, more impressive graphics chip for the Saturn. Though those at Sega of America were excited for the potential Silicon Graphics chip, Sega of Japan felt much the opposite, and the deal fell through. The Saturn would not get a more powerful graphics chip, and Kalinske still felt that the Saturn would not sell well if brought to market in North America. At one point, in frustration, he even referred Silicon Graphics to Sega's main competitor, Nintendo. Nintendo and Silicon Graphics would end up working together, and Silicon Graphics technology would find its way into the Nintendo 64 console. It was soon made apparent that, despite the objections of Kalinske and others in the US, the Saturn was going to have to come out there sometime in 1995. Meanwhile, at STI, due to issues with internal politics, Sonic 32X project head Michael Kosaka would leave the company. This left the project without a leader and with only 4 consistent team members: a concept artist, a designer, and 2 programmers. With Sonic 32X lacking direction and Sega itself in a state of agitated confusion, it seemed that the project that would become Sonic X-Treme perhaps would crash and burn before it could even get off the ground.
I think when Yogi said fork in the road, he meant opportunity. When he sees opportunity, he takes it. So do we. We're taking all the opportunities we can to make this business soar. And since I began my remarks with an announcement, I may as well finish with another. We started our rollout of Sega Saturn yesterday. We're at retail today in 1,800 Toys R Us, software, etc., and electronic boutique stores around the US and Canada.
This was part of Sega's press conference at the first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 for short. Along with Sega, there was also console manufacturer presence from Sony, who had their PlayStation console already out in Japan and coming out just a few months later in North America, and Nintendo, who still had their Nintendo 64 console going through development. Sega of America had made plans for a huge launch for the Saturn in the US, creating a massive nationwide event called Saturn Day that would take place in late 1995. However, their chosen date would come within mere days of the launch of the PlayStation. Thus, during their E3 press conference, Tom Kalinske announced that the Sega Saturn would be out that very day. It would only be at select retailers and would cost $399 US. This announcement had come as a surprise and shock to many. Though the Saturn had beaten the PlayStation to market in North America by several months, the surprise launch had incensed many people, including several game developers and game retailers, who were already eagerly planning for Saturn Day. Some went so far as to even blacklist Sega, vowing to never work with them again. As for Sony, they had just this to say about the PlayStation's price during their press conference.
$299.
The PlayStation was still a few months away, but was going to be $100 less than the Saturn. In addition, due to the surprise launch, the Saturn was somewhat hard to find, and on top of that, it had come out in North America not even a year after Sega of America had released the 32X, a platform that had already seen a price cut and seemed to be falling to the wayside. In short, the North American Sega Saturn launch was a disaster. Of course, many at Sega of America still didn't want anything to do with it, despite it already being out and on sale. Other ideas for other potential consoles that perhaps would be more viable competitors against the PlayStation, were still being drawn up. One such system would be a collaboration between Sega and technology company Nvidia. The Sega Nvidia console would combine both aspects of the Saturn with specs and features that could potentially appeal to PC gamers. While this system would have similar graphical capabilities to the Saturn, there are rumors that would perhaps be cartridge-based, like the cancelled Project Jupiter. Despite the botched release of the Saturn and falling sales of the 32X, and Sonic 32X being positioned as a drive title, which is to say, a title intended to bring in a massive amounts of sales for Sega, after Michael Kosaka's departure from STI, it was opted to have development for Sonic 32X to be moved to computers built to the rough specs of this proposed Sega Nvidia console instead of the Saturn.
Sega of America had their version of hardware they wanted to do, which was a cartridge-based system using NVIDIA technology, like a curved-based technology. I think they called it the Riva TNT. In fact, they actually produced a number of video cards, 3D PC video cards using that tech. And then Sega of Japan had the Saturn, right? And so they were kind of competing to see who, number one, what tech was, more capable, and then, what was lower cost, and so what would compete better with the, better with a Super Nintendo and stuff. So eventually, Sega of Japan forced the Saturn to be the number one, right? They said, we can't do two hardware platforms is crazy. So Sega of America, we're gonna, you're not doing this deal with NVIDIA, and you're gonna have to take the Saturn. So then we shifted again. We were only on the NVIDIA platform for, and we actually didn't have any development hardware. It was all being developed on PC with theoretical specs. So we were only on it for a couple months, so we didn't lose that much time, but then it was a pivot over to Saturn.
With Kosaka's departure, also came some reshuffling of the Sonic 32X team. This would include Senn becoming the new lead designer, giving him the ability to take the project in a direction that he saw as new and exciting.
Michael Kosaka created the Mars design. When he left, I took that opportunity to try and go in a direction that excited me more. His design was solid and more traditional, but I wanted to explore new ways of approaching the design, story, etc.
While this was happening, a Sonic title for the 32X did come from Japan in the form of Knuckles Chaotix. Unlike the Sonic X-Treme project, Chaotix featured gameplay very similar in style to those of the main Sega Genesis Sonic games. However, Chaotix was also merely a Sonic spin-off, and the Blue Hedgehog himself had little to no presence within it. It would sell poorly. The size and scope of Sonic X-Treme's development grew dramatically during this period. According to Wallis, by autumn 1995, the team included himself, at least 9 artists and animators, 4 programmers, 3 designers, a composer, and the executive producer. And, with the shift to the Saturn, it finally seemed like Sega of America knew what console was going to define its future. What was perhaps odd then was that as 1995 began to draw to a close and work continued on the Sonic project, as how its development process seemed to begin to spiral out of control. According to producer Mike Wallis,
"This was the most fucked up organization chart that I had ever had the misfortune of working on. It was set up matrix style, which for those of you who understand business organizational management know is a concept that works in theory, but is so foobarred in practice. Especially for game development. In a nutshell, what it meant was that all the artists report to an art director, the designers to a design lead, and the programmers to a technical lead. Each of those 3 groups reports to the VP. As producer, I was technically running the project, except that in a matrix style, I only have dotted line authority over the above mentioned groups. Therefore, all of the responsibility, but none of the authority. And as you can see, if any of those groups did not want to do something or wanted to work on something different than what the others were working on, they could go ahead and do it if their director gave them the okay. So we had artists doing art for levels that hadn't even been concepted out. We had programmers waiting and waiting and waiting until every minute detail had been concepted out, and we had designers doing whatever the hell they wanted. The art director had trained his art team to hate the designers and programmers. It was a mess, and because of the internal politics, it was even more difficult to get any work done.
He would go on to say in our own interview,
So, I think that the development was always, it was unusual because the way the team was originally structured, so they hired a hotshot programmer, Ofer Alon, right? You probably know his name, who got along extremely well with Chris Senn. He's what we term in the industry a cowboy coder, right? Because he's very good, very capable, but doesn't work well with others, right? Other programmers. And so there was already an existing programmer on the team, Don Goddard. And so when Ofer came in, they immediately clashed, right? So they had an immediate clash. And also Ofer was allowed by the VP of STI to work from home often. And so a lot of times he was not in the office. And because he was primarily working on the PC rather than on the Saturn, he had to then port code over to the Saturn, on a regular basis. Now, he had never done a console title before, and when you're working on PC, you've got, you have memory managers, you've got all these systems that kind of manage all this stuff for you. But when you're working on console, you don't have that. At least back then, right? Maybe now you do, because they're much more capable and they have full OSs and everything. But back then, you had to go right to the machine, right to the hardware, and a lot of machine language and assembly and everything. And he was not capable of doing that, because what he did was he wrote all these memory managers for Saturn and everything. So by the time he ported a bunch of his code or all of his code onto Saturn, it was running at like 3 FPS.
Eventually, the Sonic X-Treme development team would split into 2 groups. One would consist just of programmer Ofer Alon and Chris Senn, who would be responsible for the main portion of the game. The rest of the team would be tasked with creating boss levels and assets. This secondary team would feature a young, incredibly talented programmer by the name of Christina Coffin. Coffin had joined Sega earlier in 1995, shortly after leaving developer Sculptured Software, where she'd worked as a programmer for several projects for the Super Nintendo and PlayStation. Her programming skills would make her one of the X-Treme project's greatest assets. Meanwhile, with Elan and Senn, their part of Sonic X-Treme was running into an entire fleet of issues. Ofer Elan was doing all of his coding work on a PC. He intended to port over his work to the Saturn at a later point. That would be easier said than done. While main development work on the game was running into trouble, work was also being done on potential storylines. Sonic X-Treme had 8 different storylines sought up for it during development. The earliest of these came from Chris Senn himself and was put to paper in 1995. Its introduction went as follows.
Peace reigned on planet Mobius following the evil Dr. Robotnik's defeat in the floating island adventure. For a long time, the inhabitants enjoyed a tranquil existence. It seemed to most Mobites that Robotnik had packed his bags and left their world for a different place. Sonic, though, had a different opinion. For as long as he could remember, Ivo Robotnik had a burning desire to control the power of the Chaos Emeralds. It seemed odd that he would ever lose interest in them. Sonic wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery and sent Tails to the floating island for Knuckles. Once together, Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles formulated a search plan. Deciding to meet back at Knothole with any news of Robotnik's whereabouts, Knuckles and Tails took off to the skies in the biplane while Sonic scorched across the land. That was the last Sonic saw of his friends.
However, the most popular storyline that was considered for Sonic X-Treme was also the one that was eventually used in marketing. Being a Drive title for the Saturn, and being a title that Sega ultimately hoped would be a defining game of Christmas 1996, Sega set aside a hefty amount of marketing money for this game. Most of this marketing would begin in mid-1996. With this came a series of magazine spreads called the Red Shoe Diaries. These would include information on the game itself, the team behind it, and even teased a potential plotline, which went as follows.
The new story introduces 2 new characters, one an old man named Professor Gazebo Bubowski, and the second his daughter, Tiara B. Neither character is playable in the game, but they are both well represented in the game's cinematic, and there is always the possibility of future involvement in the later adventures. As with every great hero, Sonic's greatest joy in life comes from saving his friends from the clutches of evil, and in Sonic X-Treme, very little has changed. At the beginning of the game, we find Sonic doing a little surfing when he sees the blue streak distress signal in the sky. The signal is coming from Professor Gazebo Bubowski, and his daughter Tiara B. Sonic and Drag, you make the call. Keepers of the 6 magical rings of order, and the castle where they practice the ancient art of ringsmithing. Bubowski and Tiara are in fear that Dr. Robotnik, Sonic's arch nemesis, is after their precious rings. Dr. Robotnik has, at this point, already made one attempt at stealing the rings of order. It is determined that only Sonic can fight off Robotnik's attempts, and to do so, he will need to collect the 6 rings himself. From there, Sonic sets off to gather the 6 magical rings of order, battling Robotnik's badniks all the way. Just another day in the life of a super hedgehog.
Though Tiara B is mentioned as being unplayable, this was not always the case. In fact, Chris Senn had originally wanted there to be a variety of playable characters. Along with Tiara, these would initially include Sonic series staples Miles, Tails, Prower, and Knuckles the Echidna. Christina Coffin also at one point pushed for Amy Rose, the Sonic series' resident manic pixie dream girl. Ultimately, only Sonic himself would make it into Sonic X-Treme as a playable character. Apparently, this came due to programmer Ofer Elan wanting to place emphasis on keeping things simple. Despite this, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy would all be playable in the later Sonic adventure for the Sega Dreamcast. The Sonic X-Treme team also hoped to provide a unique gameplay experience that involves Sonic traversing a completely 3D world. Instead of featuring a somewhat top-down perspective with a movable camera, like would soon be popularized in platformers such as Super Mario 64, Sonic X-Treme would instead feature levels given a primarily cylindrical design, with the camera pointed straight ahead but still centered on Sonic himself. Sonic would also be given the ability to run up certain walls and ceilings. The in-game camera would also have a fisheye lens effect applied to it, done in an attempt to allow players to see more of their surroundings in each level. The intent was levels that seemed to encourage players to run through them while simultaneously appearing linear only at first glance. Granted, due to the camera angle, any levels involving Sonic running towards the camera could be problematic, as seen in other games at the time that employed a similar camera technique, such as Crash Bandicoot. Despite the project seeming to balloon in size, work continued steadily during the tail end of 1995 and into the beginning of 1996. It seemed to some that Sonic X-Treme really did have the chance to be one of 1996's defining video games. But all was not as it seemed. In early 1996, Chris Senn suddenly became incredibly sick. However, he tried to push through, continuing his work on the project. This would lead, as he would later recount, to it feeling like there were more bad days working on the project than good. He would say in a 2008 interview that would appear on his own website,
"On a typical day, I would wake up feeling nauseous, get ready, and get to work while driving with a cup of water, hoping if I sip it slowly, I won't puke on the way to work. My side hurts as I get into the office, just in time for a meeting I forgot. I'm sitting on a couch, leaning almost prone while the meeting commences. Mike Wallis is going over some schedule questions, with Robert Morgan sitting across, and O'Fair sitting next to me. Mike is polite and tries to get some coding time estimates from O'Fair, who avoids answering. Robert chimes in to provide an answer. O'Fair remains silent, knowing that whatever estimate is provided is bogus anyway. Bob Steele enters the room, apologizing for being late due to another meeting he just got out of with artists he's managing. I feel like I'm going to puke and sip the rest of my water. I manage to make it through the meeting and go to my office and close the door. I dry heave in the wastebasket. God, how am I going to get all this stuff done? I'm way behind on delivering final enemy designs to Ross Harris, who's been doing a stellar job following my designs and direction to achieve an awesome look for the sprites only he could create. I'm also behind on getting a demo level together using the latest version of O'Fair's editor. Unfortunately, there's a rare bug with the editor, so I can't save my work. Mike pops in and tells me Patrick from Game Players is coming after lunch for his first meeting with the team to interview us and get to know the game. That's just great, I think. Just when stuff isn't working and I have a million things to do. Knock on the door. It's Richard Wheeler. He comes in and immediately feels my stress. "You okay, dude?" he says, as I stare at my screen, going over an enemy design image I have open in Deluxe Paint Animator. I hollowly say, "I guess," as I flip through frames. "What you working on?" he asks. "I'm working on..." as I quickly draw bulging eyes on the enemy and draw lines in the word "stressing out" above it. Rick chuckles. I flip to another frame and draw something silly on top of the frames and make a noise with my mouth to represent the silliness. He laughs, I start flipping through frames and making more silliness, and we both start laughing. And it's not even lunch yet.
In January 1996, attempt was finally made to port the game engine that O'Fair had been creating on PC over to the Saturn. The results were disastrous.
O'Fair didn't want to work and play well with others. And really, we as managers and leaders of the project let it go on for too long, right? Hindsight 2020, right? That should have never taken place. We should have insisted that he come into the office, that he code straight onto the Saturn hardware, and then we could have seen where the limitations were, and then we could have scoped some of the design and development accordingly. But we let it linger too long on the PC. As the development window shrunk, right? Because we had to be out by Christmas of '96. Robert Morgan, who was the tech director, took it to an external programming house. I think they were called Point of View in Southern California. And he's like, "Look, I need you guys to get this PC game up and running on Saturn." And these guys knew Saturn very well. They did a lot of work for Sega before. And so they were able to get it up and running. But it was still not at the FPS level that we expected from a Sonic game.
POV was brought on to the Sonic X-Treme project at a crucial time. This was January 1996, and STI was expecting a visit in March from a team of Sega management, including Sega of Japan president Hayao Nakayama. Their visit would decide the fate of the X-Treme project, which due to performance issues was risking further delay or even cancellation. However, it soon appeared that POV would be doing more than simply trying to port Alon's game engine from the PC to the Saturn. At a meeting in early 1996, both O'Fair Alon and Chris Senn were informed by STI technical director Robert Morgan that POV would be assuming all major programming duties. Alon effectively was being demoted and removed from the project. At the meeting between Senn, Alon, Morgan, and a team from POV, a demonstration was shown of Sonic running along a basic checkerboard surface. While not massively impressive, it was enough to please those that needed to at SOA. Alon was also apparently unfazed with the decision to remove him from the project. Perhaps he had been expecting it. Senn, on the other hand, was shocked and appalled by SOA's decision. He saw it as Sega wanting to restart the game from scratch. In reality, POV's work for the next few months was mostly just going to consist of them trying to port an older, more stable version of Alon's game engine to the Saturn. The ultimate result, though, was Senn and Alon going off with the work so far and continuing to develop it, hoping to pitch it to Sega as a new Sonic game for PC. Perhaps this new game, which was simply referred to as Sonic PC, could be published by Sega Soft, a new offshoot of SOA that was allowed to create games for non-Sega platforms. Months went by and work continued on Sonic X-Treme. More shakeups continued within Sega of America, including President and CEO Tom Kalinske leaving in early 1996. This was due in part to the lacking sales of the Saturn, and due in part to poor relations with the Japanese side of the company. But the X-Treme team still carried on, hoping that their work would impress and that Sonic X-Treme itself could save the Saturn. Finally, March arrived. The morning of the meeting, Nakayama, then Sega of America's CEO Shoichiro Irimajiri, and an entire entourage of Sega executives, mostly from Japan, arrived at the STI offices, ready to see the work accomplished over the past nearly 2 years. There were technically 3 game demos meant to be shown off to the executives. The first was what was intended to be the main portion of Sonic X-Treme, initially created by Ophara Alon and Chris Senn and now ported over to the Saturn by Point of View. The second was a boss level demonstration, created primarily by Christina Coffin, and the final one was an attempt by Alon and Senn to pitch Sonic PC, despite Chris Senn still suffering from his odd illness that had onset in January. Silence gripped the STI office as the first demo was displayed. POV's team had worked hard on porting over Alon's work and attempting to optimize it. Though release was still months away, it was hoped that POV would have the game up and running somewhat smoothly. With luck, the executives would not only find their work passable, but impressive. But this was not the case. Most in the room seemed very visibly disappointed. Nakayama, however, was livid. Though 2 months had passed since POV was tasked with porting Alon's work, it was only managing to run at a few frames a second. The executives felt that the game was nowhere near where it was supposed to be. It seemed that could have been killed off right then and there. But it wasn't. Nakayama and Irimajiri had a change of heart after witnessing a demonstration of the boss engine, originally created solely by Christina Coffin. In late 1995, when the X-Treme development team was split, each side was tasked with making 2 different styles of game. Coffin saw this as a chance to do something truly new and creative. After all, along with being an experienced programmer, she was also a dedicated Sonic fan. She loved the games and the character. Thus, she saw this as a chance to do something potentially next level. Much like Alon, she was described by some as not always working well with others. Senn would later say of her,
Chris Coffin was a wild stallion and didn't take direction well, but when unleashed did great stuff.
Whatever the reason, in late 1995, she began work on her own boss engine, doing the bulk of the work in her small apartment in her free time. After a few months, she finally felt comfortable enough to showcase it to the other STI staff. According to Wallis, they were incredibly impressed. Whether it had been done due to feeling that she had to prove herself, or just due to feeling dedicated to the X-Treme project, Coffin had made a fairly smooth running engine that seemed to allow for more impressive movement and camera control than Alon's work on the PC. According to Coffin herself, in a later interview of Sonic Retro user Andrew75, controlling Sonic in a boss level based off of her engine would go as follows.
The left and right triggers were set up to rotate the camera around Sonic. You could also press a certain button on the Saturn controller to lock the camera onto the boss, so then all of your D-pad movement would become relative to the boss character. For example, with the lock-on mode controls, left and right on the D-pad lets you circle strafe left and right while facing the boss, which is good for dodging projectiles from Mechasonic. Up made you run towards the boss while the camera is still looking at them, and down made you run away from the boss while the camera is still looking at them. As you can imagine, fighting the boss with the camera in lock-on mode is very useful to dodge harmful things from the boss. It makes it feel more like a one-on-one fighting game, which is what I wanted. Having the unlocked camera mode where the camera stays in third-person view behind Sonic is useful as well. so your choice really depends on player preference and certain bosses. For example, I had plans for another boss to spawn smaller enemies around them that you would have to jump or spin dash into, and then go back to fighting the main boss, where the third-person view behind Sonic would be very, very useful.
Following the positive initial reception, Coffin's boss engine was adopted by the team and, over half a year later, was presented to the Sega executives following the underwhelming demonstration from POV. The executives, too, were impressed. The Sega executives saw a potential bright future for the X-Treme project in the part of the project built off of Coffin's work. They also felt that the work done by POV was best pushed into the proverbial garbage can. Before he left, Sega of America's CEO Shoichiro Irimajiri abruptly stopped in front of the X-Treme team and pointed at the boss level demo. He left them with a seemingly simple directive: make the whole game like this.
What do you mean you couldn't catch him? Guy's fast as lightning, boss. He just disappeared in the blue streak. You idiot. You should have set a trap. Boss, he blasted right through it. I'm telling you, he's bigger and badder than before.
This was a promotional video made to show off Sonic X-Treme. It was to be featured at the second annual E3 Expo in Los Angeles. And the game here, to many, appeared impressive. But the process of getting to this point had been hellish. Back in March, after the Sega executives had been presented with Sonic X-Treme's development process, which earned mixed reactions, it was decided that there needed to be some changes at STI.
Irimajiri didn't even want to see the PC version. He saw the boss level, he's like, make it like this, and then he left. And so that kind of pivoted the whole team, because number one, we weren't going to use the port team anymore, the point of view guys. And then number two, we knew now that because Irimajiri's like, you got to make it like this, we had to make it like that, right? I mean, the main game had to run like that. So we basically took Chris Coffin, who was the main game boss programmer, and then brought 4 or 5 artists and animators onto the team, myself, a tools programmer, and then basically locked us into this office at STI, right? And key card access only, a few people have access to it. And they brought in lunch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? And they're like, do what you guys can do to get this game out by Christmas, because we really need it to be a drive title for Saturn.
Sega of America itself would also see continued changes. One of the biggest, and perhaps most controversial of these, came in April 1996 when Bernie Stolar was hired to be Sega of America's new president and chief operating officer. Stolar, upon joining, surveyed the state that Sega of America was in. The Saturn was way down in sales, especially compared to the PlayStation. Perhaps most importantly, Sega of Japan had another console project in the works, one that would eventually see release in North America in 1999. It was a console more powerful than anything on the market at the time, one that would include features such as a built-in modem, allowing gamers to easily play online with their friends. It would be known as the Sega Dreamcast. It was also, however, a few years away. In April 1996, as far as most at Sega were concerned, the Saturn was still their future. Stolar saw this as an opportunity to restructure. He felt that though there was a lot of talent at Sega of America, there was also a lot of people that were not strong enough to do their jobs. As such, in the following months, nearly 300 people would be let go from SOA. Stolar was also, however, more than willing to work with Wallis and the Sonic X-Treme team. Shortly after joining the company, he paid Wallis a visit, asking what he could do to best help the X-Treme project. Upon consulting with his team, Wallis returned to Stolar with a request. They would like the game engine from Nights into Dreams.
So at that time, Bernie Stolar, he was an SVP at Sony PlayStation. He joined Sega of America as the new president, right? So Tom Kalinski's out, Bernie Stolar's in, and one of Bernie's first or the first order of business for him, he came and meet with me, and he's like, what do I need to do in order to help you get this game out? And so I told him, right, so I said, okay, we need to isolate the team, feed them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right, get them all the tools and contract help we need. And then so after consulting with the team further, the team said, we need the Knights engine, because Knights had already launched. It was very successful. And, it was pseudo 3D. And we're like, we need the Knights engine, and we can adapt the existing design to work within the Knights engine.
Knights was a title made in Japan by Sonic Team. Like with Sonic 1, it would feature Yuji Naka as the lead programmer, and as the person most credited with developing its game engine. Seeing release in mid-1996, this title would feature stunning visuals and complex gameplay. This title would follow the titular Knights, an androgynous creature that appears in the dreams of two children, Clarice and Elliot, as they take them on an adventure through the world of Nightopia. It would be described by some as being a 2.5D game, as in, though each level was made of 3D polygons, depending on who the player was controlling, they'd explore each environment in either 3D or on a 2D axis. The X-Treme team felt that the Knights engine would be of significant help towards completing their game, especially as, due to Knights being so close to release, its engine was highly stable. Stoller agreed with Wallis on this, and after some talks with Sega of Japan, editing tools and engine code made their way to SDI. A new era for Sonic X-Treme dawned. A new direction for the game, combining both elements of the Knights engine and Christina Coffin's Boss engine, had emerged. This version of the game was internally named Project Condor. It seemed that, finally, Sonic X-Treme had a chance of being finished in time for Christmas 1996. However, trouble would strike again only 2 weeks later.
We started to get the code base, the editors, the tools, and everything. But Knights was Naka's game, and Naka actually, from what I heard, right, it's all hearsay, but he apparently didn't like STI, or he didn't like STI owning any of his IP. Even though we're still within the same company and we're all really on the same team, he didn't like it, right? So I heard that he said, if Sega of America uses this, I'm going to quit. And he gave an ultimatum to Sega Japan. And so he was kind of the golden boy, right? So Sega Japan then came back to Stoller and said, you can't use the Knights engine, right? So now we wasted 2 or 3 weeks because we had been spending time getting familiar with the engine, getting all of the production pipeline set up and everything. And now we had to kind of go back to square one.
E3 came, and along with it, a showcase of Sonic X-Treme. Perhaps oddly, some promotional materials showed gameplay from builds based off of O'Farah Lawn's game engine. Game demos present at the show, though, featured builds of the games heavily based off of Christina Coffin's Boss engine. An early test level was prevalently showcased, referred to in-game as Jade Gully Zone, along with an incomplete boss fight. Though the project was far from complete, what's shown was enough to pique the interest of press and the public. According to a journalist from Game Players magazine, an article run their post-E3 issue,
there actually wasn't that much of Sonic X-Treme shown at E3, but there was a playable version of an incomplete boss round. Still, the demo on display, coupled with Game Players' ongoing exclusive coverage of the game's development process, has given every indication that the third dimension has been very good to everyone's favorite Blue Buddy.
Meanwhile, a journalist from the UK-based Computer and Video Games magazine would write in their July 1996 issue,
Sonic runs into and out of the screen, in addition to left to right, and can roll around most terrain, taking the rest of the screen with him most of the time. Cool new abilities include throwing rings, along with the Spin Slash, a mid-air 360-degree attack, and the Sonic Streak. The Spin Dash is also back, bonus rounds are guaranteed, but most exciting of all is that Sega are keeping certain aspects of the gameplay completely secret.
Of course, some of this secretness perhaps came from the game's turbulent spot in development. Following E3, a decision was made at STI to again rearrange the X-Treme team and further seclude them from the rest of Sega of America. This left both Chris Senn and Christina Coffin with more duties on the project. Team members would begin to regularly go into overtime working on it, with some seemingly moving into the STI office. Chris Senn recalled working on the game in 16 to 18-hour shifts at times. He would work with minimal breaks, having meals delivered to him and others as they labored, sleeping on a portable cot in his office, all the while still combating his illness. Meanwhile, sometime in early summer 1996, Christina Coffin had moved out of her small apartment and into the STI office. One morning, she'd shown up with a large papasan chair, which she seemed to live out of for most of the next few months. Wallis recalls some regularly showering in their office building's gym. Progress was proceeding at an incredible rate through summer 1996, but also at an incredible cost to those involved. It was evident that an exhaustive, potentially unhealthy amount of work was being put into the game. But there was also much optimism surrounding the project, with the only noticeable outcry coming from an animator that Wallis ended up firing.
It was super stressful, right? I mean, the team was pretty good-natured. I mean, we had, there was one guy, an animator, who I had to fire because he was just being an ass, right? I mean, he's like, oh, you guys, you're pushing yourselves too much, and you're working too hard, and but everybody had signed up for it. We asked for volunteers. We're like, okay, we're going to do with this insane crunch, but we'll be heavily rewarded at the end, and we're really excited about getting this game out. And this guy he volunteered, but he begrudgingly came along, and all throughout the months of development, he was always kind of there, right? I mean, he would put in 9-10 hours a day. So, everyone else is working 12, 14, and he's doing like 9 or 10, which, okay, he wasn't critical path, so it was okay. And we tolerated it, but there was one meeting where we had a meeting at 5 o'clock and we were doing a status report, and he stood up and he said, oh, it's 5:30, I gotta go. He's like, it's 5:30, I'm leaving now, I don't work past 5:30. And then he just got up and walked out, right? Such a douchebag move. And so I'm looking around the room as producer, and I'm like, okay, guys, I don't know about you, but I'm ready to fire him. And they're like, yeah, we would endorse that. And so I went to HR, and I said, I want to get rid of this guy. Talked to Manny Granillo, the director of development, and they're like, yep, make it happen. So next day he came into work, and I escorted him out.
Sonic X-Treme was transformed drastically from its pre-E3 state. Though nowhere near completion, by July, it seemed like it was coming together well. This, of course, still came at a cost. Chris Senn would later recall in an interview with Lost Levels,
I spent 1 month creating the layout, textures, and a few simple enemies for 4 worlds. Game time was about 5 to 8 minutes per world, and I'd say they were 80% fully textured, meaning that all of the general textures that set the mood, lighting, color schemes, etc. were in place with some details, but the last 20% would have required a great deal of detailed polish to really make it look finished. The worlds were passable, but definitely not what I would have submitted as finished. I did what I could in the time that was available.
But then, as the summer was about to end, critical disaster struck. Problems first came for Chris Senn. Senn had been under an incredible amount of stress while working, and as a result had endured reoccurring sickness. Throughout the first half of 1996, he had dropped nearly 25 pounds of weight and was suffering from constant cramps and nausea. Around this time, his doctor informed him that if he continued to push himself like this, he would be dead within 6 months. Feeling like his body would soon collapse unless he took a break, in August 1996, Chris Senn stepped down from the project. But while this was a major blow to Sonic X-Treme, the team still had Christina Coffin and her incredible coding skills. Problems too would soon strike her though. Much like Senn, Coffin had been pushing herself greatly, sometimes putting in 18-hour workdays, and it was taking a toll on her. Around the time that Senn decided to leave the team, Christina Coffin contracted walking pneumonia. Though initially she tried to work through it, she was soon ordered by her doctor to take a few weeks off from work. In response to this news, worried for her health and fearing that if she continued on she would die, she too stepped down from the X-Treme project. The game seriously crippled and facing massive delays, Wallis decided to make a tough decision. It would be best to kill Sonic X-Treme before it could kill any of those working on it. At the end of August 1996, Mike Wallis informed Sega of America management that the project could not continue on. Sonic X-Treme was officially cancelled. Though, this was not the end of Sonic on the Saturn.
I knew at that point we're not going to make it, right? So I went to Manny Granillo, who was the director of development at Sega, and Bernie Stoller, had a meeting with them, and I'm like, look, here's the situation, right? We can't get the game done without Chris Coffin, so Sonic X-Treme is not going to happen. And they said, okay, Mike, we've been working on this. We have been putting together this plan to do, because I was also working on Sonic 3D Blast for Genesis, right? So they said, we've been putting together this plan to do Sonic 3D Blast on Saturn, maybe up-resing it, taking advantage of Saturn capabilities to bring this game out on Saturn in time for Christmas. So we want you to produce that game. And so, I did. So we had Redbook audio and, 3D bonus levels and things like that. Great soundtrack. I mean, probably, I think, one of the best Sonic game soundtracks. So Sonic X-Treme is done.
Sonic 3D Blast would be the final Sonic game to be released on the Genesis, and would stand out due to its isometric graphical style. Despite the short turnaround time, the Saturn port would see release only 2 weeks after the Genesis version. It would go on to be the second best-selling Saturn game of 1996, only being beaten out by Nights into Dreams. Though 3D Blast was a Sonic game on the Saturn, perhaps due to being a port of a Sonic game for a previous generation console, and not being as impressive as, say, Crash Bandicoot for the PlayStation, or Super Mario 64 for the Nintendo 64, it was not much of a system seller. As for Chris Senn and O'Farrell's Sonic PC project, though they had done considerable work on it, it never got the green light from Sega. Sometime in late 1996, they pitched the game to Sega's PC gaming division. However, Senn and Alon were told that Sega was just looking to port existing titles to PC, and that it wasn't in their budget to finance a completely new game. Senn would say of this news,
"The point at which I realized the project itself wasn't going to be released was after O'Fair, Allen, and I had pitched Sonic PC to Shinobu Toyota, who basically told us that Sega couldn't proceed."
Though Sonic X-Treme was never released, its cancellation was also not the death knell for the Saturn. That, debatably, came the following year during E3 1997, when Bernie Stolar publicly stated, "The Saturn is not our future." This would not officially kill the Saturn, but it did make many view Sega as admitting that they had failed, and thus would stop fighting against the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. The Sega Saturn would remain on the market in North America until 1999, when the Sega Dreamcast would be released. The Dreamcast would have many revolutionary features, and even have the first fully 3D Sonic game on it. This would be Sonic Adventure. This title would feature Sonic in a fully 3D world with a movable camera, and would feature the playable additions of characters such as Tails, Knuckles, and Amy Rose. It would be a critical success, and even spawn a sequel in 2001 in the form of Sonic Adventure 2. The initial success of the Dreamcast and Sonic Adventure, though, would not be enough to save Sega. In 2000, Sony would release the PlayStation 2. It would eventually sell over 150 million systems, becoming one of the best-selling video game consoles of all time. In addition, despite strong marketing and a host of critically acclaimed games supporting the Dreamcast, Sega's blunders in the previous console generations were enough to keep away many developers, retailers, and consumers. This culminated in January 2001, when Sega announced that, in March of that year, the Dreamcast would be discontinued. Though Sega would still develop new games, they would no longer create their own hardware. They had formally declared defeat in the console wars. As Sonic Adventure later showed, even if Sonic X-Treme had released and become a killer app for the Saturn, Sega would still be affected by an entirely separate set of factors, the most prominent being ill will earned from a long series of questionable decisions. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps it could have changed things for Sega. Perhaps it could have even saved the Saturn. Perhaps Sonic X-Treme could have been one of the most influential games of all time, had it not suffered death in development.